Hi, all. Welcome back to Introduction to American Politics. Hopefully, by this week, you've had a chance to interact with some of the material in our first learning module. Hopefully, you've had a chance to read some of the chapters on collective action problems in politics and view the lectures on collective action theory. And hopefully, this will give you a better understanding of how government, constitutions, rules of the game can allow for the coordination for collective action, can allow groups of people to come together and make common decisions. Today we're going to shift our focus and we're going to talk about the origins of American constitutional tradition, the origins of the constitutions of the United States of America. And we're going to specifically step back in time a little bit and ask ourselves how the political, social, demographic, economic, and cultural experience of early America shaped the design of the Articles of Confederation and ultimately of the Constitution of the United States of America. When I talk about early America, I'm referring to colonial America, pre-revolutionary America, the period when each of the 13 colonies that would ultimately come together to form the United States of America existed independently and autonomously of each other. There was no larger government holding them together as there is today. As we have this discussion, we'll ask ourselves what pressures led to the creation of the Articles of Confederation, who the winners and losers were under these Articles of Confederation, and how the experience of self-governance under these Articles of Confederation shaped the design of the Constitution of the United States. One of the first things I want you to appreciate about early pre-revolutionary colonial life in America was its tremendous diversity. I'm actually quite fascinated by this because it might help explain not only some of what is included in our Constitution, but some of the things that the founders chose to exclude from the Constitution, namely national languages and national religion. So the first thing to appreciate is that there was considerable diversity in language, in religion, in country of origin in the early colonies. Although many of the settlers were of English descent, English settlers who'd come to the New World either for trade opportunities or religious freedom, there were also large pockets of other European migrants in colonial America. For example, there was a large German migration to colonial America, specifically to Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York. There was a reasonably large Dutch population in New York, which previously had been New Amsterdam under Dutch colonialization. And if we were to expand beyond the 13 colonies, we would find considerable pockets of other European settlements. To the north, French Canada, to the Midwest, French settlements going down to Detroit, St. Louis, and then Spanish efforts to settle in Florida, Mexico, Texas. So there was already in this colonial moment considerable diversity of language in colonial America. With this diversity of language was also considerable diversity of religion. Now, we often talk about the colonial religious experience as being a divide between southern colonies, which were Anglican, Episcopalian, the Church of England, and northern colonies, which were Protestant, Puritan variants of religion, but it was much more diverse than that. First, I want you to appreciate that there was tremendous variation in the forms of Christianity, the different disciplines of Christianity that were being practiced in colonial America. It is true that there were many Protestants, but there was diversity within the Protestant tradition in America. There were Episcopalians, there were German Baptists, Quakers, Puritans, Dutch Mennonites, French Huguenots. So as you can appreciate, there wasn't a uniform way that people were choosing to practice a religion in America. Instead, it was a tradition of diversity. There were early pockets of Judaism in early American colonial life. So what do we make of this? Well, my thought is that this really did shape some of the things that show up in the American Constitution. Specifically, what's left out. So, if we're going to flash forward a little bit, we might ask ourselves, why was the Constitution, why did our founders choose to leave a national language out of the Constitution? And it turns out that because of the linguistic diversity, it wasn't clear exactly what language the Constitution would be drafted in. There were large German pockets in Pennsylvania, for example, and so maybe in their wisdom, what the founders chose to do was to leave aside a question of the national language, decide perhaps that in its diversity we didn't need to declare one. The other thing I want to address is the decision of our founders to leave aside a national religion. This is a pretty important choice, and it might help us clarify some of the debates we see in contemporary American politics, when you'll often see people debate whether or not the United States was founded as a Christian nation by pointing to the many different traditions of Christianity that were practiced at the time of our founding. Now, one of the things I'd like to remark on is, to me, this seems to miss the point a little bit of how the debates over an official religion may have unfolded. When our founders were drafting the Constitution of the United States of America, they were keenly aware of how divisive questions of religion could be. Many of the colonists to America had themselves fled religious persecution in Europe and come to the United States to be able to practice their faith in relative freedom. As importantly, these founders were students of the European wars of religion. So they were well aware, for example, of the bloody battles between the French Huguenots and Catholics, which had cost the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Europeans. So rather than choosing to adopt an official religion, again, they recognized the need to create a spaced accommodation for all faiths within the Constitution they would ultimately draft. Another point that's really important to make here is on the diversity of economy in the American colonial era. There was a large agricultural economy in the southern colonies, mercantile economy in the north. But what I really find fascinating is that, that the economies of the American colonies may have allowed them to earn a little bit of independence. I remember reading an article a while back, which discussed the relative economies or advantages of different nations and states in the New World. And it compared Argentina to colonial America. And as it turns out, for European colonial powers, for the European powers that were interested in colonizing the New World, places like Argentina may have looked more attractive than colonial North America. And the reason is the factor advantages, the wealth that was perceived to be in the Southern Hemisphere. Argentina famously was thought to have large amounts of mineral wealth that could be extracted and returned to Spain, to the colonial masters in Europe. The early American colonies were largely viewed to be less attractive. They especially in the Northeast, didn't have the agricultural promise that the Southern colonies did, and they were largely neglected in some regard. And so that rather than having an extractive economy where the colonial power wanted to dominate and extract resources and bring them back to Europe, the colonists in early colonial America were given some independence, some leeway to pursue their own affairs. And we'll learn about that in a second. Finally, I'd like you to appreciate that the colonists lived under constant presence of military threat. First, threats from European actors. So the colonial governments in the southern United States, Georgia, South Carolina, for example, were adjacent to Spain, certainly attentive to Florida, Spanish presence in North America. More importantly, in the north, there was French Canada and the French presence, and this is at a time when the French and English governments were constantly at war. And then there was the threats of native peoples perceived by the colonies. So they were constantly worried about being insecure in terms of military preparedness. Um, Now, the colonists, in addition to having a diverse economy, had a very interesting thing that ends up being very important for American constitutionalism. They had what we call tradition of self-governance. Under English colonialism, the colonists were given home rule. They were largely allowed to make determinations over their own domestic affairs independent of uh, the English Parliament. So they were able to raise taxes and make decisions over the domestic affairs of their colonial government. They had early traditions of elected assemblies. They were choosing representatives to go to assemblies and make decisions, for example, about taxation and domestic policy on their behalf. And they asserted these rights to levy and collect taxes for colonial governments. This led to a tradition, if you follow the links, of early written constitutions, colonial constitutions and charters that were somewhat elaborate versions of early constitutional governance. I'm not going to link to them right now, but you might enjoy reading them because they're pretty spectacular. You can go to the early constitution here, I believe of Connecticut, and you'll discover that they not only lay out a very long series of rules and requirements for the laws that people must follow, but that these laws are often, to us, amazingly antiquated. They seem very interesting. So there's very specific laws about how unruly children who don't respect their parents will be punished, or there are laws in there for how people should be punished for witchcraft and et cetera. But what's really important is it also outlines, the essence of the social contract. It says, here are the rules by which we expect people to live and abide by in our colonial government, and here's the rules for how you are going to be governed. So they have an early tradition of writing down constitutional government and an early tradition of some autonomy and self-determination in who represents them and how they consent to be taxed and make collective decisions. Now, although there was a tradition of home rule in this plural early America, there were some important limits to this self-governance. The first is that although the colonists retained the ability to make decisions over domestic affairs, to levy and raise taxes for domestic choice, England retained control over the military and trade in early American colonial government. What that means is that the colonists were dependent upon their English colonial masters, if you will, to provide for military protection. More importantly, the colonies had no international trade delegations, no efforts to independently negotiate trade. This was controlled by England. There were also, at the time, very little negotiation or incentives for collective action between the colonies, because England retained control over both military and trade and organized for the national defense and trade both between the colonies and to Europe. There weren't these incentives promoting collective action. Now, we might ask then, what triggers a call for an American Constitution? What triggers the American Revolutionary moment? And we'll briefly review the impetus for revolution. So at the time in colonial America, the British government, the English government, is in Europe and in the New World at a long war, a 7 Years' War with France. And after the 7 Years' War, England, the monarch, the king, decided they need to raise revenue to pay for the war effort. And they decided to challenge home rule by establishing taxes, famously the stamp tax of 1765 and later the tea tax of 1773, taxing colonial citizens in part to pay for the debts incurred for fighting the 7 Years' War. The logic from the monarch and parliament is largely that they had fought this war in part to provide for the defense of colonial subjects, and therefore it was right that colonial subjects would be taxed to pay for the debt incurred in the effort to fight this war. This was viewed, though, famously, as I'm sure many of you know, and outrageously, as no taxation without representation. It galvanized the American colonists, who were outraged at being forced to pay what they viewed as coercive taxes, taxes they didn't want to pay, without any say in whether they were taxed or why they would be taxed or the amount they were taxed. They were outraged. And it's culminated in the picture with the famous Boston Tea Party, where there's a small rebellion of people in Boston stormed a ship, threw the cargo of the ship into the Boston harbor in protest of these taxes. Now, this might have gone away, but the British government's response to this rebellion, this little revolt in Boston, galvanized early Americans. The British government responded with the restraining acts and the coercive acts, essentially punishing Massachusetts. They closed all Massachusetts ports to trade, right? Strangling off the lifeline of Massachusetts. They dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly, ending self-determination, home rule within the colony. They decreed that British troops be quartered, reside, live in American homes, and that American and British soldiers, both when charged with crime, be sent to England. To help you understand why this was so outrageous for our American colonists, it's worth thinking about some of the scandals of the Iraq War in the early 2000s. One of the scandals was that US troops and US mercenaries in Iraq who were accused of crime were often brought back to the United States to be prosecuted for those crimes. And of course, Iraqis viewed this as terribly unfair and injustice. The crime had been committed in their country under occupation by our military, and this led to calls for the US to withdraw from Iraq. Well, a similar thing was happening in our war of religion. We were colonized by the British, and when there were potential war crimes or just crimes committed by British troops, these troops were not going to be prosecuted in the colonies by colonial juries, but they would be sent back to England. Obviously, the colonists thought this was injustice. Also, think about the decree that British troops be quartered, that British troops be required to be permitted to live in the homes of the colonists. And just imagine that today. We're all under self-isolation. Now imagine having a British soldier being required to be quartered in your house. Obviously, this is meant to suppress the revolutionary impulse in America in this moment, but instead it's viewed as terribly unjust and galvanizes, builds support for revolution, calls for autonomy, for self-determination, the famous line, no taxation without representation. Right? The colonists are calling for their own government. It leads to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new form of government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I want to pause for a second on this Declaration of Independence and help you understand what a remarkable moment this is. We often discuss the American Revolution as being a fairly limited revolution, quite rightly. Now, we focus on so many of the groups that were excluded in the American democratic moment, in the American Constitution. This is largely, for example, a revolution and a call to revolution by wealthy white land-holding men. And it's absolutely correct criticism, and we will unpack it for the remainder of the quarter. We'll unpack the tremendous paradox of the American Constitution, which at the one time tries to fulfill this promise in the Declaration of Independence of self-determination, of the belief that all men are created equal, while at the same time, as we'll learn about going forward, constitutionally declaring African slaves in the colonies to be 3/5 of a human being. Right? So we'll talk about the paradox of this democratic moment in the United States. But what I want you to remark upon briefly here is the revolutionary nature of this. This is an important thought. These colonists had been reading contemporary political theory coming out of England, out of Europe. They were students of Montesquieu, they were students of John Locke and Hobbes. They read about Roman and Greek traditions of governance. They were really intellectual, although we often refer to them as citizen politicians. That does a disservice to what tremendous thought was going in to the government that these founders, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, the tremendous thought that was put into the creation of our new government, of this idea that people could rule through self-determination. So the British tyranny in the colonial era, the excessive taxation, the effort to brutally suppress early revolt in Boston, leads to this galvanizing call, a Declaration of Independence, a call to establish a new government of men, governments instituted by men who consent to be governed by themselves, and when the government is unjust, can abolish it. This leads to the creation of the Articles of Confederation. Now, as we'll learn, the Articles of Confederation is the first effort to create a national government among the colonies, to unify the colonies in an effort to create a new system of government that can also effectively resist English oppression. And the factors of Articles of Confederation are very interesting. They have to figure out, following this Declaration of Independence, how do we put together a new government that avoids the problems we were living under the English monarchy, and preserves what we liked about home rule and independence. And so as they start to talk about creating an Articles of Confederation, there's some things that really shape the type of government, type of national government they're going to create. The first is that their experience with monarchy makes them very distrustful of centralized authority. They are, in fact, in the midst of a revolt against a monarch, against a tyrannical king from England, as they perceive it. And the last thing they want to do is replace this king with another of their own. They do not want to create conditions where they are oppressed yet again. They don't want to submit to a tyranny of the minority. So they are very distrustful of creating any strong central government or figure within that central government. The second thing is they continue to value domestic independence. What they want most of all is autonomy. They want to be free of oppression and have the ability to make their determinations over their own affairs. And they have very little experience with interstate cooperation, especially in the provision of defense or trade. They do create a government under the Articles of Confederation, which we can think of as the first Constitution of the United States of America. They create in these Articles of Confederation, and we will talk about this in some more detail in lectures to come, a permanent Congress where each state receives one vote. Now think about that for a second. Regardless of the size of the state, congressional representation gives each of these early colonial governments, each state within this new Article of Confederation, one vote, right? So New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Delaware, they're all going to have one vote in this early Congress. The major laws of the Congress, any major laws made by this new national government, by a Continental Congress, taxes, changes to the Constitution, require unanimous consent for all states. What does that mean? That means for anything significant to be done, and remember, this is in the middle of a war with a much stronger colonial power, any changes, any national law that's major requires unanimous consent. Now, if you've seen the lectures on collective action and transaction and conformity costs, you should already be anticipating that this may be a difficult way of making decisions. Because it's true that conformity costs under the Articles of Confederation will be low. If anyone doesn't want to live under law, all they have to do is not vote for it and the law's not made. But the transaction costs are going to be very, very high. It's going to be hard to get each of these governments to agree. Again, for military, states raise the revenues themselves independently. They raise taxes. They outfit the troops for battle independently. The national military answers to Congress. Now think about this again. Each of the states is intended to contribute soldiers, materials, weapons to this war, this revolution that we're having against England, being fought, being led by George Washington, the Continental Army. And yet this new national government has no power to compel the states to make these contributions. The states themselves control the ability to raise revenue, raise taxes, and outfit troops for battle. So again, if you've been thinking about collective action, you can see that there's going to be a problem of free ridership here, right? Among the 13 colonies, the revolution is being fought in New York, in Massachusetts, in Virginia, and these large states are outfitting the troops for battle. They're paying the cost of the war, but smaller states, maybe states that aren't immediately as threatened or immediately as capable, are free riding on the larger states. They're electing to under provide for the war effort. And of course, what happens if each of the 13 states chooses to hold back? Oh, we're going to let the other government provide for the monies and troops for battle. We'll free ride, we'll benefit from that while not paying into it. The collective good is going to collapse. And that's shockingly what's happening during the early efforts to fight the war. The colonial government, the government of the Articles of Confederation, is simply struggling to maintain an army in this moment of crisis because of this provision that the military largely be provisioned by independent contributions of revenue and taxes and troops for battle by each of the different colonial governments. They create no national executive, no national judiciary. So there's no president who can coordinate for the war effort or interact diplomatically with other nations. The states themselves in this Articles of Confederation retain the authority to negotiate trade overseas, and the states print and coin their own money. So what you have here is a picture, as we're going to learn, of a national government that's going to be pretty weak. It's a national government which has a Congress, but a Congress that requires unanimous consent of all of the members in order to get anything done. A national government which can make major laws, but major laws requires that every single one of the 13 colonies approve of the laws, regardless of their size. A new national government that has a military, but is woefully ill-equipped to fight because the states themselves, rather than national government, are left to raise monies and troops. There's no national judiciary, no president to coordinate for collective action, and the states themselves retain powers to negotiate overseas and print and coin their own money. Now we'll talk about this in more detail in our next lecture. But speaking of collective action, you should start thinking right now about what are the strengths and weaknesses of a government established like it was under the Articles of Confederation. What drawbacks are embedded or built into this new national government under the Articles of Confederation? Do the decision rules of the Articles of Confederation create high or low transaction costs? And do they create high or low conformity costs? Most importantly, what is going to be the predictable outcome of a government that is organized around these principles? How is it going to be able to resolve problems of free ridership, resolve problems of coordination, and how is it going to be able to do so in a time of crisis, in a time of revolution? As we'll learn, it's going to fail. It's going to fail predictably, and this is what's going to lead to the subsequent calls for a new constitution that becomes the Constitution of the United States of America. I hope you're enjoying your modules so far, and I look forward to talking to you soon.